Happy New Year. It's good to see we've filled in a little bit. I know it's tough getting over all those hangovers and everything. Happy New Year. I'm glad you're here. I know there's a lot of people who are traveling and missing. I know a lot of people stayed up late last night, too. So glad to see you are here, especially on this cold morning. Norm, I got to admire anybody wearing a Hawaiian shirt on a day like today. He is the man, isn't he? He is awesome. We talk about this time of year. We come up with these resolutions. I think the wisest one I heard was from Allison, who decided her resolution was to make no resolutions. That's one she can keep. I think any time of reflection is good. Any time where we actually sit down and sort of think about our lives, think about our habits, good or bad, think about how we manage our time, how we manage our money. I think that's always a good thing. But what I worry about as a minister is, do we approach it from a godly standpoint? Do we sort of sit there and say, what do I want to do? What do I want to be different? How do I want to be better? How do I want to, or do we actually sit down and say, what is God calling me to do now? What would God like me to improve in my life? How would God like me to change my time management and priorities? Or my money management and priorities? Or my health management and priorities? I hope and pray that we as a congregation would approach it from that standpoint. That it wouldn't just be a matter of, okay, it's a new year, I want to lose 10 pounds, or I'd like to do this or that, I'd like to be more active, I'd like to go to the gym more, or do we really say, God, help me know. Help me to determine what it is you would like me to do in this new year. Because that should be something we're always doing, not just at New Year's. I like what Dan said, that our time for reflection is every week. I think God knew if we waited a year, we'd be in trouble. So we get together weekly to reflect on what God has called us to do, to remind each other what God has called us to do. And so at this time, I didn't want to belabor that, but I just wanted to, let's reflect on that. As a congregation, as individuals, what is God calling us to do in this new year? Something new. And I like the bit about having a plan, because the fact is, we can say I want to do it. Yeah, I got to throw this in. Don't get generic. I want to be a better person. I just want to do better. I want to be a better employee. Get specific about your resolutions. Get specific about what God has called you to do. Not just be better, but to really resolve to let God shine through your life, whether it's at your workplace, with your neighbors, whatever it is you're doing. Someone took my clicker. Who's got the clicker? This is a bad way to start the year off here. Thank you very much. Red water. We're in John chapter 6. One of those interesting stories. We're all familiar with it, but let's try to look at it and reflect anew about this story. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. Now this is interesting, just the way he says that, because at the time Jesus was there, everyone would have called it the Sea of Galilee. And the only reason John would throw in the Sea of Tiberias is that we're about 60 to 70 years later, and the sea had been renamed in honor of the emperor Tiberius. And so at the time of John, everyone would have known it as Tiberias, but at the time it was happening, it would have been known as the Sea of Galilee. It's just one of those little indications about when the book was written that confirms the timing of that. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. And again, we read over that, and that's not a detail to skip. If you knew someone was, healing people, and you might think, someone had a cold or something, but if you had like someone who was dying of cancer, and Jesus came through, put his hand on him, and the cancer was gone. And you find out he was doing that to a bunch of people. And people that hadn't walked or hadn't been blind, and I'd go a long way to go see that. I'd want to go see what's going on. He drew a huge crowd was following him because he was doing things that were absolutely incredible. And that attracted the crowd. Then Jesus went up to the mountainside and sat down with his disciples. Jewish Passover was near. When Jesus looked up and saw the great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where should we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. But Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Another disciple, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, and where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water. And they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were headed. Now, if you know anything about the Sea of Galilee, if they got 3.5 miles from shore, they had a whole lot of miles to go. And so when Jesus gets in the water, the boat's at the shore. That would have left an impression on me, especially if I'd been a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee all of my life. They would have known something a little weird happened there. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had left there, and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but that they had all gone away, that he'd gone away alone. They'd gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. Once the crowd realized neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. They just wanted to see Jesus. They wanted to see what he was going to do next. So let's look at the context. Jesus is ministering in Galilee. He crosses the lake probably to get some quiet time. I mean, he's been out doing a lot of work, a lot of healing, a lot of stuff like that, and he thought, let's get in the boat, just him and his disciples, and get across the sea to find a little quiet time, a little rest and relaxation. Take a day off. And 5,000 men show up and want to hear what he has to say. So I imagine you might have been a little disappointed. I've had those days, where working all week, I typically will try to take Friday and Saturday off. It doesn't always work, but I'll get there to Thursday. I've got my sermon wrapped up. I've got my Bible classes ready. I've visited the people I needed to visit, and it's about 4:35. I'm thinking about getting out a little early, and there's a knock at the door. And someone says, "Pastor, I just need to talk to somebody." Yeah, sure, come in. You're looking for that little break. And 5,000 people show up and say, "We just need to hear some more." So Jesus takes care of it. A great crowd of people followed him because they saw his miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. He knew they were just coming to see a show. He knew they were impressed with something amazing, something incredible. The healings he was doing were unheard of. Oh, there were healers and there were doctors, but not like this. And he knew they were coming to see a show again. And Jesus really wasn't interested in the show. He was interested in their souls. They were impressed by his miraculous abilities, but they didn't really understand who he was. They thought they knew. Some of them had a pretty good idea. Some of them had the right title. But they really didn't understand what he was about. So he walks up to what we now know as the Golan Heights, and as the people sit down while he shares his message of the kingdom of God. And from the other Gospels, we can tell he talked to them for quite a while. He spoke for a long time. And we learned this in Kenya, when I've mentioned this before, but when people walk 10 to 15 miles to church, a 20 to 30 minute sermon isn't going to cut it. I remember the first time I got up and did my 20 to 30 minute sermon, and I sat down, and the guy, one of the Kenyans, said, "So do you need a rest?" I said, "What?" "Well, you only spoke for 30 minutes. We've got 2 hours for preaching." I thought, okay, this is going to get interesting. So I learned to preach a lot longer. You go out into a village, it's an all-day affair. And you'd better have plans because they just want to hear you speak. And in fact, in Kenya, I found out I had to be ready to speak anytime, anywhere. I went to visit one of our Christians in the hospital, and they found out I was the pastor and asked me to preach to the entire ward. And, you can't say, "Oh, I'm a preacher, but I just don't have a sermon." It just doesn't work, And so you start learning to preach anywhere, under any circumstances. And so Jesus had been talking all day. These people had walked a long way around the lake to find him. They wanted to hear what he had to say. And so he taught them. He shared with them. I don't think he could help it. Even if he was tired, even if he was looking for a little quiet time, a little rest, when he saw the needs of the people, he couldn't stop. Now, they were out in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing around, no town, no village, no nothing. And I love Jesus' interaction with his disciples on this. Looked up, saw the great crowd, and said to Philip, "Where should we buy bread for all these people to eat?" Now, it was just one of those questions. There wasn't where. It was like there was nothing close. There was nowhere. It was one of those rhetorical questions. He'd say, "Hey, where are we going to get bread? Where are we going to go buy bread, Philip, for all these people?" And I imagine Philip was already thinking about that. He probably wasn't thinking about the crowd, but he was thinking about himself. "I'm hungry. We've been out here all day. Where are we going to get bread?" Jesus says, "Hey, where are we going to buy bread for all these people?" Well, Philip, he treats it like a math problem. Let's see. Carry the 4, 6, 8. 8 months' wages, Jesus, wouldn't buy enough bread to give everyone one bite. But, yeah. Now, Andrew's the one with a sense of humor. I'm sure between the 12 of us, we could steal this kid's lunch, but I'm not sure how far it would really solve our problem. There's a kid there with 2 fish and 5 loaves, and there's 5,000 people. I mean, the kid's lunch wouldn't cover the 12 disciples, much less a crowd of 5,000. So Andrew's just sort of throwing it out. Hey, well, here's some food. You think that's going to cut it? Jesus' response is, oh, that's plenty. Have everybody sit down. Now, we know these stories, so I don't think we react the way we should. I mean, one of them figures out 8 months' wages won't cover it. One of them's got some kid with it says small fish. Now, these aren't big fish. I don't think that would have mattered, but he's like, there's 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, and Jesus says, great, tell everyone to sit down. We're going to eat. Now, it's one thing when you're facing, I mean, most of you mothers out there understand this, facing an angry, hungry crowd, it can be dangerous. The kids don't ever show up and say, hey, Mom, you feel like cooking today? That's just not one of the phrases. It's just what's for dinner. And Dad comes home, and usually he's got a little better tone. What's for dinner? Sometimes they call ahead. They want something to look forward to, I'm hungry. Or there's the new, I love the hangry. I'm hangry, You get hungry and you start getting angry. So you got this crowd out there that's been out there all day long. And I imagine they're a little hangry. And Jesus says, where are we going to get food? And Philip's already doing the math. He's looking at the boat. I think we can make it to the boat before they can get to us. And Jesus says, and Andrew's like, hey, we got this 2 fish and 5 barley loaves. What do you think? Jesus says, look, go tell them to sit down. We're going to eat. Now, it's one thing when you're facing a hungry crowd. It's another thing to say, sit down, we're going to feed you, and you really don't have anything. So I imagine the disciples were a little nervous as they sort of told everyone, yeah, let's all sit down and relax. We're going to have a meal with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, small fish. And Jesus says, that's fine. Sit down. We're going to eat. And I love the leftover thing. I mean, that's just one of those things. When they had all had enough, Philip's, hey, this would get us 1 bite. Can you imagine? Here's your bite. And it says, when they all had enough, this was a crowd that had been out there all day with nothing to eat, and they all ate all that they wanted to. It was like a church potluck. You just went crazy. He said, gather the pieces that were left over. Let nothing be wasted. They gathered and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5. I mean, there's more baskets than barley loaves. And they filled the baskets. I'm not sure 1 barley loaf would fill a basket. And they filled them up. Loaves were left over that those who would eat. You see, Philip's math brought them up to 1, not quite 1 bite. Andrew's solution went to feed the 12. But when God gives, when God provides, He does so generously. He gives us more than we need. He just makes sure that everyone knows He's got it all. The Old Testament says God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. If this is the God that could rain manna from heaven for the whole Israelite nation, feeding a meager 5,000 people on the shore of Galilee was nothing. He didn't even work up a sweat for that one. He just said, hey, let's feed the people. First they fed them with the Word of God. But then He recognized they needed food to eat. They were hungry. And He took care of it. And He took care of it generously. You ever had someone give you something, but it wasn't generous? Well, here. Take that. I hope you appreciate it. It's costing us a lot. A lot of people sacrifice to help you with this. It doesn't really make you feel very good, and that's certainly not how God does it. When God provides, He provides very, very well and generously. But that creates a problem. After the people saw the miraculous signs that Jesus did, they began to say, surely this is the prophet of whom is to come. They were making a connection with Moses. And when I mentioned the manna from heaven, that wasn't an accident, that there was a prophecy that God would raise up a prophet like Moses. And when they saw Jesus multiplying the bread and the fish, they connected it with the manna. They connected him with the prophet. It's from Deuteronomy. I will raise up for them a prophet like you. God's talking to Moses. From among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. So they were connecting what was happening here on the Sea of Galilee with this prophecy, and they were ready to run with it. Problem was they had a different picture. Since Moses led them out of Egypt, led them out of the oppression of the Egyptians, their idea of a Messiah was someone who would lead them out of the oppression of the Romans. The Romans had conquered the area, had put laws that they didn't like, had put up idols that they certainly didn't like. And when they got out of hand, the Romans just killed a bunch of them, kind of solved the problem. So they didn't like it. They were looking for a Messiah to take them out of Roman oppression, to let the Israelites rule the world. They identified him as the prophet, and indeed he was. He was the one that God would raise up. But they didn't understand the nature of his mission. They didn't get who he really was and what he was about. Ditching the crowds. Jesus, knowing they intended to come up and make him king by force, withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Now, I've actually read several dissertations, one in particular that actually poses the disciples of Jesus as revolutionaries. Now, stay with me here just a second. That it actually presents them as they gathered around Jesus thinking he was the Messiah, but they had this kind of Messiah in mind. And that his disciples were actually sort of setting the stage and gathering people and setting Jesus up for meetings with the right people, with the right connections, so that Jesus could lead this great revolution against the Roman Empire. And I mean, if you had someone that could heal the sick and even raise the dead, you didn't really need a big army. I mean, a bunch of you gets killed, he just raises them up again. You didn't need to worry about feeding the army, because if you got 5 barley loaves and a couple of fish, he can handle that. Large numbers. I mean, this is the ideal military leader to deal with the Romans. And so there was this idea when it says Jesus, knowing that they, and again, we don't know who they is. Is that the 5,000? Is that the disciples? Or is that everybody? That they intended to come and make him king by force, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. He took off because that wasn't on his agenda. He didn't need to be made king because he already was and still is the king, but not what they thought. By now it was dark. Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing. The waters grew rough. When they had rowed 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. I always love these little, it's almost British, just these understatements. And they were terrified. Can you imagine? Have you ever been how many have been on the water in a boat in really rough seas? I mean, big waves. I had the pleasure, because I was a kid and didn't realize what kind of danger we were in, of being in a typhoon on an ocean liner. We traveled from Tokyo to San Francisco and went right into a hurricane, basically. So I thought when I got on the ship, I was about 5, 6. I thought it was a really big ship. And it looks like a really big ship until you get out on the really ginormous ocean. And when you're out there in the middle of nowhere, the ship doesn't seem that big because the ocean's just huge. And then the waves, when I realized the waves were above the railing of the ship, I didn't think the ship was that big anymore. And it makes you a little nervous. Now, of course, I was the Disneyland kid that loves the roller coasters, and so I went to the very front of the boat where it was breaking literally about 100 feet with these 50-foot waves, and I get that great rush as it dropped down, and water would spray over. Of course, I didn't realize my mother was going crazy, didn't know where I was, in the middle of a typhoon on the ship. I had a blast. It's one of those memories that really sticks in my head. But when you realize the power of the sea, and I'm guessing their fishing boat wasn't as big as the ocean liner, but that the waves may have been as big as the ones I was dealing with. And they see someone, these are fishermen. If you know anything about anybody on the water, you know that they're a little superstitious. Even people believe in God, still there's that thing about the ocean. And so they're out here. They've been out here all of their lives. They've been in rough water before. They've been through storms before. And they look out in the middle of the night and they see someone glowing, walking on the water. That's just not something you see every day. You can just see, Peter and Andrew. Hey, what's that over there? It's Jesus walking on the water. He does stuff like that. Scared him to death. This is not, they've been out here their whole life experience, never, ever, once saw anybody walking on the water at night. And so here's this figure that somehow is illuminated. I say glowing. The Bible doesn't say that, but it says they saw him in the dark on the water. I think there was some glowing going on. Something. The moonlight, it's a storm. And he walks up, and again, you got to love this. He just walks up to the boat when they're trying to row through a storm. And again, they make it really nice. It is I, don't be afraid. What it really translates, the better translation, in my opinion, would be, stop being afraid. He's like, don't you know who I am? Why are you afraid? If you know me, if you know who I am, then there's no reason to be afraid. If you're with me, there's nothing out there that can get you. It's actually a rebuke. Stop it. They're all scared to death, shaking, screaming. He walks up, he's like, stop it. It's me. Don't you know me? Why are you afraid? Stop it. If you're with me, there's nothing to fear. Jesus is present. And he's always present. There literally is nothing to fear. He's got a much bigger picture than we do. He knows what he's doing as opposed to the rest of us. And even when we can't see it, can't figure it out, don't understand it, I know. He knows what he's doing. Doesn't mean it won't hurt. Doesn't mean it won't be confusing. Doesn't mean it won't be challenging. But the fact is, we serve a good God, and he will do what is best. And we need to have confidence in that instead of worrying so much. Conclusion. This is a great passage. It talks about the balance between God. He's a spiritual being, and yet he understands our physical needs. And we, as Christians, need to balance those two. That it's too easy to get focused on one or the other. I saw this on the mission field. There were a lot of historic Christian missions, Protestant missions in Kenya, who had quit church planting altogether, quit teaching the Bible, and just worked on water projects and feeding issues, planting, helping with agriculture, all very good works, but they dropped any sort of pretense of even teaching the Word or trying to plant churches. And then there were groups like us who were almost 95% focused on planting churches and teaching the Word, but did very little to help people out physically. And there were a lot of physical needs in Kenya, as there are around the world. And this passage shows us that God cares about both. He's concerned with both. We need to be involved with both. And I know this church has a history of water projects and other development things, so we've already learned that lesson, but we need to continue to maintain that balance. God recognizes our greatest need is spiritual. Our weak, selfish, sinful nature is the biggest problem we deal with. But it's not the only problem we deal with. He provides for our physical needs as well, and he usually does it very generously. And if you don't think God has been generous with you, please come talk to me. It usually takes me about 5 minutes to help someone understand that if you just live in America, you have been generously blessed. That we are so much better off with resources than the rest of the world. But what I've found, and the principle that has really stuck in my head and my spirit, is that if we spend time focusing on all that God has given us, we feel incredibly blessed and we live very joyful, fulfilled lives. If we spend all of our time focusing on all the things we think we need that God hasn't given us, then it doesn't matter how much you do have. We become bitter, envious, jealous. And we need to do, and that's if you live in America, or if you live in Kenya, or Bangladesh, or Cambodia. But you need to realize how blessed we are. And praise God for all that he's given us. But Jesus refused to subject himself to human standards. They wanted to set up an earthly kingdom. They wanted to set up Israel as conquering the world. And I see that even today, that there's this attitude. With the Israelites, they thought, we've been oppressed and we want to take over. And I always wondered why they wanted to take over. Because you get the feeling when you read the literature of the day and what was going on politically among the Jews and among the Romans, that the Jews wanted to take over so that they could do some oppressing. I mean, they didn't want to just be left alone. They wanted to hurt somebody. They wanted to be the guy in charge who could then make slaves of everybody else. It's real easy to have to say, well, I just want to be free. I just want to be equal. I just want to be... But it really means I want to be superior and I want to impress. I've been oppressed. I want to impress others. And I hear that language even in our political arena today. And the fact of the matter is, if oppressing people is wrong, it's always wrong, no matter who gets to be the oppressor and who gets oppressed. And that we need to be against oppression, no matter who we are, what level of economy we are, what level of education we are. That wrong is wrong. And that there's nothing right about, they say two wrongs don't make a right. And we need to keep that in mind. But here's the real problem. The crowds recognize Jesus as the one. He's the prophet to come. But not really. You see, that picture of what the prophet to come was supposed to be like was completely incongruous with what the Bible was saying, with what God was about, with his priorities, with his values, with his goals, with his agenda. And too often we believe in God, we recognize God, we trust God, we pray to God, we come to church, we take communion, but our picture of who he is and what he stands for may be a little off. Because I hear too many Christians wanting to know how come God's not getting on our agenda. I go to church every Sunday, I give, I help out. How come God's not giving me this? How come God's not doing that for me? I had a very specific lady. I was amazed. We laugh because we know that's wrong, but you know what? There's some people that don't. And I had a woman in a previous congregation I worked for who just constantly was just really mad. She came into my office wanting me to explain why God wasn't doing for her what she wanted him to. Because she did all the right things. She showed up every Sunday. She contributed. She helped out with class. She did this. And I wanted my daughter to get married and live close to me, and she married some guy in Texas and moved back there. Now, what's God's problem? And my other daughter, she's got health problems and is really having social struggles, and I'm supposed to have 2 beautiful children because of all that I've done for God. She knew who he was. She recognized he's the creator of the universe. She recognized that he gave his only son, but she didn't know God. She didn't really understand what he was about. And we need to understand. We come together to encourage each other to do what God has called us to do, not what we have called God to do. Because he knows what he's doing, and he's the only one who does. And if we follow him and do what he calls us to do, we will live the lives that we were supposed to, and we will become the people he created us to be. But if we try to do it ourselves, and if we keep making our own plans, our own New Year's resolutions, we'll end up in bad places. We know God, but do we? I'd like to encourage you, encourage me, 2017. Get to know God a little better. Spend time in his word. Not just reading it, but really thinking about it. And spend time praying about it. Because we got to realize when you pray, and I know this may mess some of you up, but when we pray, the purpose of prayer is for us to change. When we talk to God, he wants us to change. And so often, at least my prayers are about changing. God, could you fix so-and-so? Could you get so-and-so off my back? Could you fix this or fix that? And what God's really wanting us to do is change ourselves. He wants to transform us. And he'll worry about. That's one of those things I just kept hearing that. God, could you? I'll handle this. But I just would like you to, I'll take care of that. It's none of your business. Boy, I hated that one. You worry about you. Oh, come on. It's so much easier to fix everybody else. Do we know God? Do we really want to know God? Because he would love to get to know us. He wants to reveal himself to us. He wants us to know him deeply, intimately. And he wants to engage us in that kind of a relationship. But we need to recognize what he's about. We need to really get to know what he wants us to do. And trust him even when we don't get it. If you have any needs this morning, please.